Okay, so once upon a time my husband and I were on a trip to Hameln, and since this is the town where the fairy tale The Pied Piper takes place, naturally a lot of the tourism is built around fairy tales. Now one day we entered a souvenir shop, and there I came across the book. The book, which is the subject of today's video. It was written by Britta Daniel Thon. Let's call it just Britta. And Britta's book had the fabulous title Grimm's Fairy Tales 2.0 Fairy Tale World Revolution. Spoiler alert, Britta didn't revolutionize anything. On the book cover, the author proclaimed that she wanted to improve those fairy tales, to make them more kid-friendly, i.e. without cruelty to people and without cruelty to animals. Well, that sounds alarming. Of course, I was very intrigued and I just had to read some of those stories, and I managed to read 2 stories. Red Riding Hood and Cinderella, before I had the feeling that I would overstay my welcome standing there and reading a book that they tried to sell. But I promise you that was enough. I mean, look at the length of this video. Imagine if I had read all of it, we would be here all day. And now, after a decade of those stories living rent-free in my head, torturing me, I decided I had to share my torture with someone. Congratulations, it's you. So strap in, folks, it's gonna be a ride. Little Red Riding Hood, or How to Traumatize Your Child. So Little Red Riding Hood goes off to the woods, armed with bread and wine for her granny. So far so good. It's only downhill from here. She comes across a she-wolf feeding her cubs, and curious as she is, she approaches the wolf to get a better look, until the she-wolf tells her, "Hey little girl, my kids don't drink when you are that close, so could you please back off?" And Red Riding Hood's like, "Okay," and goes on her merry way. And now the stupid begins. Her grandfather, which she has in this story, sees this encounter and thinks to himself, "Wow, my granddaughter is so kind and respects another creature's feelings. I have to punish her for it." So he dresses himself up as a wolf, and therefore he is the one to approach Red Riding Hood and do the whole big eyes, big hands, big mouth shtick, and pretends to eat her. So after the titular character is traumatized for life and learns that this is actually no wolf but her grandfather in front of her, she naturally asks, "What the fuck?" or something to that extent. So after making her believe that she is going to die a horrible, brutal death, Granddaddy here explains that he did this to teach her a lesson. Because earlier, when she drew so near to that she-wolf, she was putting herself in danger. So in other words, Granddaddy sees his granddaughter in a situation that he perceives as dangerous and hides in the bushes, probably nibbling his popcorn, and sees if she survives. And when she does, he emotionally scars her for life. Well, that's one way to bring up a child. But frankly, I want custody to be taken away from that man. Also, the encounter with the she-wolf wasn't framed in any way as threatening. It was pretty standard as far as conversations with wolves go. And second, as well behaved as Red Riding Hood is, Super Granddad could have probably just said, "Yo, because he would say, yo, it can be dangerous to go so close to a wolf. Please don't do that again. And Red Riding Hood would be like, okay, the end. This whole situation was completely uncalled for. The burning question is, what are children even supposed to learn from this? I better stay away from every situation which has even the slightest possibility of being dangerous, or my family members might punish me by making me fear for my life? Of course, this was not intentional, I know, but it should have been clear as day that there is really no good lesson here. And that this becomes such a madness stems from keeping essential plot points from the original while writing a totally different story. The result of refusing to have a clear antagonist is a narrative that makes no sense and has no point, and is unintentionally making your characters assholes. Speaking of which, Cinderella, or How to Ruin Your Protagonist. Cinderella 2.0 begins by painting the scene. The protagonist is now living with her loving stepmother and her loving stepsisters on a lovely farm, and everyone is so lovely and has their fair share of work to do. The problem with this improved version is so obvious. Do I even need to go on? You're smart. You know exactly why this is stupid. But I will, because it does indeed get stupider. As usual, there's the invitation to the ball in order to find the princess bride, and Cinderella goes without telling her family and without telling the prince who she is. For some reason. No, there is no reason. There's no reason. And the rest of the story in essence plays out like the original one, with one very important difference. Cinderella is a massive bitch. In this story, she deceives her loving family and her love interest, but she doesn't need to do so. Again, no antagonist, no point. And at the end, Britta has the balls to throw a dialogue at us right out of a rom-com. And not even a good one, like a Disney Channel one. When Cindy warbles to the prince, "But I lied to you about my identity." And Prince Boy replies, "Yes, but it's okay. I understand. I know you only did it because you were afraid to tell me." Prince, my boy, you see, that doesn't make it any better. If I were you, I would be seriously concerned when a relationship starts out by her lying to you about her upbringing to avoid a maybe slightly uncomfortable conversation. And what do you even mean with "I understand"? You invited her. Didn't you know what families you invited to be your potential partner? Now come to think of it, this seems to be the extensive moral of the whole book. Avoid confrontation at any cost, even if it means that you have to be a shitty person. So, Britta, you changed a strong character who manages to dig herself out of an abusive relationship to a manipulative gold digger. Thanks for that. That was definitely what this story needed to be improved. So surprise, surprise! Grimm's Fairy Tales 2.0 is really bad. But the sentiment itself is still valid, right? Could and should you rework 200-year-old tales for today's children? Given all the social insensitivities we over the years wisely thrown overboard, one might think to agree that for children this is sometimes necessary. And besides that, Grimm's fairy tales were never meant to be for children anyway, right? Right? Yeah, every now and then I come across someone on the internet proclaiming that Grimm's fairy tales weren't even in its original form meant for children, but for adults, with all the disturbing things like violence and stuff. Sometimes this is said about the stories the Grimms borrowed from, and sometimes it is said about their stories themselves. Regarding the former, sometimes yes, but most of it is Charles Perrault, and in France at the time fairy tales were mostly consumed by women and children. Regarding the latter, that's half true. Yes, the first edition from 1812 was technically not aimed at children, but violence or something had really nothing to do with it. The Grimms first and foremost were literary scholars, and they basically made their first book into a scientific argument about where story A might originate from, or what myth possibly influenced story B. Since people just wanted something to read to their children, the first edition flopped, because no one wanted this smart nonsense. This resulted in some heavy restructuring for later editions. They took only the best and stories best suited for children, and Wilhelm Grimm edited them to better fit the purpose of reading them aloud. Also, he added those iconic catchphrases like "Once upon a time" and "They lived happily ever after." The resulting book was called the Small Edition, and it was the smash hit that would make their work legendary. So, in the end, they were made especially for children. Still, that was 200 years ago. You could still argue that we need to edit those stories for our children today. Yeah, well, we already did that. Even the stories that I would read in my childhood in my Grimm's fairy tale book were not the stories from the small edition of 1825. And I'm old. Some story points are actually removed because they are too gruesome, but I would say most of the cuts were made because of streamlining purposes. In fairy tales you often have the narrative repetition of 3, and that could potentially get a little bit long for a small child. So you don't get to read the part where Cinderella's pigeons peck her sister's eyes out, and you get just that one time where Cinderella flees from the prince instead of 3, when, for example, she flees on top of a tree, and to get to her the prince chops it down while she's still on that. I mean, I didn't say the prince was any smarter in the original, now did I? So, slightly updating the source material is something that already exists. And besides keeping the actual story in those tales, there's another argument to be made against removing all the violence from Grimm's fairy tales. Firstly, it's not very graphic anyway. The literary form of fairy tales does not lend itself very well to long descriptions. Secondly, to paraphrase Germanist Heinz Röllecke here, children need an unambiguously evil entity as a threat, and by the end of the story, this entity must be completely eradicated for them to feel that their heroes are safe and everything will be alright. If you read a tale from Grimm's Fairy Tales 2.0 Revolution something, I'm pretty sure that your child won't be happy that the heroes run or learn a valuable lesson. It will just be terribly confused. The confusing thing is that from what I have been reading from Britta, how she describes her own book and the reason behind her writing it, she seems to understand this. Like all of what I just told you, she displays an understanding of what fairy tales are meant to be and children's stories are meant to be. It's just perplexing that the end result is so misguided. So she describes that she sang the song about Hansel and Gretel to her 3-year-old son, and that he was shocked about what was happening. All the bad things were happening in there. 3-year-old children can be shocked about stories. That's fine. It's going to be alright, I promise you. It's no basis for nice dreams and a safe feeling. As we've just heard, if your heroes won, yes, that is the safest feeling that a child could have at the end of the story. The motto, I scare you. There, I have a good fairy tale. You mean like Red Riding Hood's grandfather? The fairy tale that you wrote? The good has to win. Yeah, the problem is there is no good in your stories. They're all assholes. It gives children safety and strength in our unsafe world. Yes, I told you that. Also, your heroes are still assholes. There is no safety from them. To differentiate between good and evil, they don't need stepmothers dancing in burning shoes. I agree. It's a plot point that is not necessary. You know what? Other people agree with that too. That's why in most books for children this plot point is not there anymore. And the story still makes sense. Little children can differentiate between good and evil, but not how they can improve. They need positive, real heroes. As I have explained, those are not to be found in your stories. I would have liked for you to give them those heroes in your stories, but they're not. They're still assholes. The problem is, Britta, that you didn't primarily want to write stories without cruelty, but without conflict. If you try to write stories without conflict from an antagonist, the conflict has to come from somewhere else. And in your case, it comes from your protagonists being shitty people. Grimm's Fairy Tales 2.0 really is like a Disney remake. Sanitized to the point of pointlessness, and you only really get what it's supposed to be if you already know the original. In conclusion, go read the original Cinderella. It's a blast. The prince is something else. Spoiler alert, Britta didn't I cannot say the word revolution. Also, I got it. But I got it. Also, Ron? What does Ron have to do with anything? But I will. Yes, the first edition from 1812 was technically, again, no protagonist, no point. Protagonist?